The rain had started falling around 9 in the evening, turning the downtown Montreal streets into mirrors of reflected streetlights and neon signage. Kwansu Park was driving his black luxury SUV through the financial district, heading toward the Meridian Hotel where he was scheduled to meet with business associates, legitimate ones, mostly, the kind of business that his criminal empire used as cover for everything else. He was 43, had spent 25 years building himself from street gang member to one of Canada's most powerful organized crime figures. He controlled gambling operations, money laundering networks, protection rackets across Montreal and into Quebec. He was the kind of man whose presence at a meeting changed the outcome before anyone spoke. He was also distracted. He had been thinking about the call he had received that morning from his ex-wife, the woman he had been married to for 4 years before she had finally accepted that marriage to someone like him was incompatible with the kind of life she wanted to build. She had called him asking about child support. A monthly payment he had been sending faithfully for years, even though the amount was minimal considering his wealth, even though she had never asked him for money before, even though the fact that she was suddenly requesting child support suggested something was wrong. He had asked what was happening. She had told him she did not want to discuss it over the phone. She had asked if they could meet. He had agreed to meet her after his business meeting at the hotel, had suggested a coffee shop nearby, had tried not to think about what it might mean that his ex-wife suddenly needed money. The traffic light ahead was red. He was 3 blocks from the hotel, in no particular hurry. The streets were wet from rain, the sidewalks mostly empty because it was late, and the weather was terrible. He was thinking about what his ex-wife might need to tell him when he saw movement from his right. A small figure, maybe 6 or 7 years old, ran into the street without looking. Kwansu swerved instinctively, but the wet pavement offered no traction, and the massive SUV did not stop as quickly as it should have. He heard the impact, not severe, just the glancing blow of the vehicle catching the small body, just enough contact to send the child sprawling onto the wet pavement. He immediately pulled the vehicle to the side and got out, his mind cycling through multiple realities simultaneously. Timeline 1. He had hit a child. Timeline 2. This was going to create complications that could implicate his organization in an accident that looked innocent but could be used against him. Timeline 3. A child was lying on the wet pavement and he had hit him. Timeline 3 was the one that seemed to matter as he approached the figure. The child was conscious, crying, struggling to stand up. He was wearing clothes that had been expensive once but were now worn and tattered, oversized as though he had borrowed them from someone much larger. His backpack was soaked through with rain, and he was terrified. That was the moment when she appeared. She ran toward them from the direction the child had come, her heels clicking rapidly on the wet pavement, her designer coat flapping behind her. She was moving with the desperation of someone who had thought they might lose something irreplaceable. Kwansu recognized her immediately, even though he had not seen her in 3 years. It was his ex-wife, Amara. The woman he had left because maintaining a relationship with her was incompatible with the criminal life he had chosen to live. The woman he had hurt by choosing his organization over their marriage. The woman he had never stopped thinking about, not entirely, no matter how much time had passed. She dropped to her knees beside the child, her hands running over him, checking for injuries, looking for visible damage. She was crying, her glamorous exterior cracking to reveal genuine terror. "Are you hurt? Can you move? Where does it hurt?" The child looked confused and frightened, but he did not seem to be seriously injured. He was crying from shock and from being scared, not from genuine pain. "It's okay. You're okay. I'm here," Amara said to the child, wrapping one arm around him, pulling him close, her tears streaming down her face. That was when Kwansu realized that the child looked familiar. Not just because he was a child she was protecting, but because there was something in his face, something in the shape of his eyes and the structure of his nose, that was familiar in the way that only your own genetics could make something familiar. "Amara, what is?" She looked up at him, and her expression shifted from terror to something harder, something that combined rage and despair and something like resignation. "This is our son," she said flatly. "His name is Daniel. He is 8 years old. And you just hit him with your car." The world stopped. Kwon-soo stared at the child, stared at Amara, stared at the coincidence of running into them on a rain-soaked Montreal street, of accidentally hitting the child with his SUV, of having his entire understanding of his life suddenly reorganized around a fact that he had never known existed.
What? How?
You said you were not pregnant I was not pregnant when we were married. I became pregnant after you chose your organization over our marriage. After you told me that you could not maintain a relationship because it was incompatible with your work. After you ended everything without giving me any opportunity to discuss alternatives. She was holding the child protectively, her entire body positioned between Kwon-soo and Daniel as if she was afraid he might do something dangerous. Why did you not tell me? Why did you not contact me? Because you had made it clear that you did not want to be in my life. Because I decided that I did not want someone like you influencing a child's development. Because I tried to build a life for my son that did not involve organized crime and violence and fear. She looked down at the child, who was still frightened, still not understanding what was happening. I was doing fine. I had a job. I had an apartment. I was managing. And then the recession happened, and I lost my job. And then I lost my apartment. And then I ended up here, on the streets, unable to afford proper housing, unable to afford enough food, unable to afford the life my son deserves. Where have you been living? In a shelter. When there is space. On the streets when there is not. I have been trying to figure out how to get us out of this situation, how to get my son to a safe place, how to rebuild what we had before everything fell apart. Kwon-soo understood with sudden clarity why she had called him that morning asking about child support. She had not been asking for additional money. She had been asking about the payments she had not received, about the monthly transfer that should have been arriving in her account for years. I have been sending money, every month, $1,200, the amount we agreed on. You sent money to an account that I had to close 3 years ago when I lost my job and could no longer afford the fees. You never contacted me to confirm whether the payments were actually reaching me. You never followed up to see if I was managing. You sent money to a bank account and then convinced yourself that you had fulfilled your responsibility. The accusation landed like a physical blow. She was right. He had sent the money, but he had not actually verified that she was receiving it. He had not contacted her to confirm her current situation. He had essentially sent money to an account and then forgotten about it, satisfied that he was fulfilling his obligation as a father in the most minimal sense. I can help you. I can get you into housing immediately. I can provide whatever resources you need. I do not want your money. I do not want your criminal resources. I want you to acknowledge that your choices created this situation. I want you to understand that Daniel has been living in poverty because his father chose organized crime over his family. I want you to understand what that choice actually costs. She stood, still holding the child protectively. I am taking him to the hospital. I need to make sure he does not have any internal injuries from your car hitting him. And then I am going to report this accident to the police, because despite everything, I cannot let someone hit my child and drive away without consequences. Amara, wait.
Please.
Let me help you. Let me do something. You have had 8 years to do something. You have had 8 years to be part of our lives. You chose not to be. And now you want to solve the problem by throwing money at it. That is not how this works. She walked away with the child, disappearing into the rainy night, leaving Kwon-soo standing beside his luxury SUV with the realization that he had a son he had never met, that his ex-wife had been living in poverty while he was building a criminal empire, that the coincidence of hitting the child with his car was not coincidence at all but consequence. Consequence of his choices, consequence of his refusal to maintain any connection with the woman he had married, consequence of his assumption that sending money to an account was the same as actually being present in someone's life. The police arrived because someone had called about the accident. They interviewed Kwon-soo, took information about the incident, observed that the child did not appear to be seriously injured. They seemed prepared to classify it as an accident, driver error on a rainy street, nothing that required further investigation. But then Amara arrived at the hospital. She had taken the child to emergency room as she said she would, and she had contacted the police, had reported the accident, had provided the license plate number of the vehicle. What followed was a public incident that Kwon Su's organization could not control. The news reported it as a hit and run, which it technically was not, because Kwon Su had not fled the scene, but the narrative quickly became about a wealthy businessman in a luxury vehicle hitting a homeless child. The story developed dimensions that Kwon Su had not anticipated. Journalists began investigating his background, began asking questions about his business interests, began connecting dots between his known associates and organized crime activities. For the first time in his career, Kwon Su's organization was under significant public and police scrutiny. More importantly, for the first time in his career, Kwon Su cared more about resolving a personal crisis than about protecting his criminal enterprise. He hired private investigators to locate Amara and Daniel, arranged for them to be placed in secure housing immediately, hired medical specialists to ensure the child was recovering properly from the accident. He also hired lawyers, legitimate ones, focused on family law rather than criminal defense, to begin the process of establishing paternity and custody arrangements. Amara resisted every attempt at intervention. She refused his housing offer and continued to live in the shelter. She refused his financial support and continued to work whatever jobs she could find. She refused to allow him to see Daniel, refused to discuss custody arrangements, refused to acknowledge that his willingness to help was anything other than an attempt to control the narrative around the accident. You want to be the hero who helps the homeless woman and her child. But that is not heroic. That is just trying to fix the consequences of your own choices by throwing resources at the problem. Kwon Su found himself facing a situation that his criminal organization could not solve and that his money could not resolve. He began to visit the shelter where Amara and Daniel were living, not to pressure them but simply to be present. He brought supplies, warm clothes, food, medicine. He did not demand anything in return. He simply left the items and waited to see if Amara would accept them. For the first month, she refused everything. For the second month, she accepted the supplies but still refused to speak with him. For the third month, she accepted the supplies and allowed him 15 minutes of supervised time with Daniel in the shelter's common area. The first time Kwon Su actually had a conversation with his 8-year-old son, he did not know what to say. Daniel was wary, traumatized by living in poverty, confused by this man his mother said was his father, unsure whether trusting him was safe. "Your mother says I am your father. Are you?"
Yes.
"I am. I am very sorry that I was not present in your life." "Why were you not present?" The question was simple and unanswerable. Kwon Su tried to explain about his organization, about the incompatibility between his criminal life and family life, about the choice he had made to keep his wife and son away from his world. But Daniel was 8 years old, and to an 8-year-old, the explanation sounded like an excuse. "So you chose your work over me?"
Yes.
"I did. That was not a good choice."
No.
It was not. Over the following months, Kwon Su slowly earned the right to spend more time with his son. He attended school events with Amara's permission. He helped Daniel with homework. He began to be present in small ways, demonstrating through consistent action rather than through grand gestures that his commitment to being in their lives was genuine. He also made a decision that shocked everyone who knew him. He began the process of dismantling his criminal organization. Not quickly, not without complications, but deliberately, systematically. He transferred his interests to trusted lieutenants, reduced his direct involvement in operations, began the transition toward complete separation from organized crime. "Why are you doing this?" his second-in-command asked him. "Because I cannot be the man my son needs if I am the man I have been. And I have realized that the woman I love, Amara, will never trust me, will never allow me to be fully present in their lives, if I remain the person I was when they entered my life. You are throwing away power that took you decades to build. I am choosing something else. I am choosing my family over my empire. That is a choice I should have made 8 years ago." 1 year after hitting Daniel with his car, Kwon Su had completely extracted himself from organized crime. He had legitimate business interests, investments in real estate and technology, financial security that would support his family for multiple generations without requiring any illegal activity. He had also reconciled with Amara. Not immediately, Trust that had been broken over 8 years of absence could not be rebuilt in months. But gradually, through consistent presence and genuine transformation, he had demonstrated that he was capable of being the man she had married before he had chosen his criminal organization over their relationship. 2 years after the accident on the rainy Montreal street, Kwon-soo and Amara moved into a home together with Daniel. Not a mansion. Kwon-soo had chosen something modest, something that reflected the life they were building together rather than the wealth he had accumulated in his criminal past. Daniel was now 10 years old, was thriving in school, was beginning to develop the kind of trust in his father that could only come from watching him show up consistently, day after day, choosing his family over everything else. That Christmas, Amara gave Kwon-soo a gift. A framed photograph of the three of them taken at a community event. On the back, she had written, "The man I married would never have made the choice you made." He understood what she meant. The man she had married had been promising, but not yet transformed. The man who had hit their son with his car and had then chosen to actually become his father had been willing to sacrifice everything for that transformation. 3 years after the accident, Kwon-soo was asked to speak at a rehabilitation program for people transitioning out of organized crime. He was asked to discuss how he had managed to extract himself from his organization and rebuild his life. "I had to understand that the power I had accumulated was not actually power. It was the appearance of control over situations that were ultimately uncontrollable. Real power was the power to choose differently, to acknowledge that my previous choices had been wrong, to commit to transformation even when that transformation required sacrificing everything I had built." He paused, looking out at the audience filled with people who were trying to do what he had done. "I had a son for 8 years before I met him. I paid child support to an account that he was no longer receiving money from and convinced myself that I was fulfilling my responsibility as a father. It took hitting him with my car to force me to understand what actual responsibility looked like." Someone in the audience asked, "Do you regret the years you spent in organized crime?" "I regret every moment I spent believing that I was protecting my family by keeping them away from that world, when what I was actually doing was abandoning them. I regret the poverty my son experienced because I chose my organization over his welfare. I regret the woman I love trying to raise our child alone because I decided that maintaining a relationship was incompatible with my work." He paused, his voice becoming quieter. "But I do not regret that it took an accident to force me to change. Because the consequence of that accident, the discovery of my son, the journey of rebuilding my relationship with the woman I loved, the process of transforming myself into someone worthy of their respect, that consequence has given my life meaning that power and wealth never could." 5 years after the accident, Amara and Kwon-soo remarried. Not in a grand ceremony, but in a small gathering with family and close friends. Daniel stood beside his father as they exchanged vows, understanding in ways that only a child who had lived in poverty could understand that his parents' commitment to each other represented not just love but redemption, transformation, the willingness to choose each other over everything else. After the ceremony, Daniel hugged his father. "I am proud of you," the 13-year-old said. "For what?" "For choosing us. For becoming someone I can be proud of. For understanding that being my father matters more than being powerful." Kwon-soo held his son and understood that this moment, this simple acknowledgement of genuine transformation, was worth more than any empire he had ever built. He had hit a child with his car on a rainy Montreal street and had discovered that the accident was not an accident but a consequence, and that the consequence had redirected his entire life towards something that actually mattered. The homeless boy living in a shelter, the mother working impossible hours to provide for him, the man who had hit them and then had finally understood what his absence had cost. They had all been transformed by the moment when Kwon-soo had chosen to become the father and husband he should have been all along.